Hello, Stephen Asma. Welcome to Chinwag.
Hello, Paul Giamatti. Good to see you, my friend.
Nice to see you, sir. Always a pleasure. Welcome to Le Chinwag. This is a good one tonight. Steve and I are flying solo or flying,
That's right.
flying duo or whatever we say. We're going to be talking cryptids today.
Cryptids.
Cryptozoology. Now, before we get into this, yes, Professor, will you define cryptozoology or cryptid for me?
Yeah, good, because we're going to talk about specific cases, but some people may not know what cryptozoology is, and it basically is the study of creatures that may or may not be real. So there's sort of obvious ones like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, but there's a ton of stuff that we thought did not exist, and then it turned out to be discovered, and it was real, and we put it in the natural classification, and now there's a science of it. So it's pretty fun territory because it's not all craziness. It's also got the potential of really discovering new life forms. So those new life forms are called cryptids, IDS, cryptids.
Which is a heretofore hypothesized creature, or?
Yeah, undescribed. Undescribed from a scientific nomenclature, I think, is the way to
and as you say, things like the Sasquatch and various sort of lake monsters, the Chupacabra, things like that.
Yeah,
and
Chupacabra.
Steve and I are keeping it all American too. Actually,
that's right.
Which today we're talking American cryptids. American cryptid. That's a good title for something.
It's a good book title.
It really is. It's strong.
Every state has some kind of cryptids, and it's kind of fun to see what the regional creatures
That's right.
are.
And I'm sure that within each state, there's probably, different counties and towns probably have their own things.
Totally.
But what we kind of tried to ferret out were the sort of more famous ones of each state. So we're going to cover maybe, I don't know, 2 or maybe several. I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll see how drunk I actually am tonight, and we'll see how far I actually go. But I'm going to kick it off.
Do it.
I'm going to kick it off, Steve, and I'm going to take us into the dark primeval forests of the great state of Maine.
Maine.
The state of Maine, which is dear to my heart. I have a lot of family from Maine, which is one of the reasons I think. I got a lot of deep Maine roots, Steve, and up there in the tremendous state of Maine, there's a creature that wanders the dark primeval forests, known as the Ambajagus giant, Steve, named for Lake Ambajagus, or Jumbo, or Old Moxie. But we may be familiar with this as the Spectre Moose of the great state of Maine.
The Spectre Moose.
The Spectre Moose.
I've heard of none of these creatures, by the way.
No, I've not either. I'd not heard of the Spectre Moose. 30,000 moose, I think it's estimated, live in the state of Maine or thereabouts.
Is that right?
Yes, and maybe in that kind of greater New England area, because they're all over New England, which I discovered in reading about this, and they're all over the place. And but there's only one Spectre Moose, I think, maybe. We'll see.
Well, it's not a species. It's a single.
Well, hang on. Don't get ahead of yourself here, Stephen. Don't get ahead of me. Hang on. Hang on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take us back in a little time travel here on the Chinwag.
Please.
Dateline, Bangor, Maine, January 8th, 1938, special to the New York Times. For more than a generation, Maine has had a, quote, Spectre Moose. As I'm reading you an actual report.
Fantastic.
There was one 36 years ago, another in 1917, still another in 1932, and now he is stalking again in a branch of the Penobscot River. Hunters get near enough to be appalled by this gigantic beast, but seldom within range for an effective shot. In the accumulating lore of the forest, he is described as 10 to 15 feet high. That's big.
Oh, my.
Yeah, now I'm not sure how big a moose is anyway, but that sounds big. He is, quote, dirty white in color, and he brandishes immense antlers. Not only his ghostly hue, but also his keen scent, acute hearing, and seemingly magical power of instant disappearance have built up the legend of this wraith. The skeptics say there ain't no such critter. They're doing a bad Maine accent thing in here. But a man named Houston or Houston, I'm not sure, brings this story of the latest visitation. This is 1938. On his way to a camp after a timber cruise around Chesuncock Lake, He came into an open bog 30 acres across where 16 moose were feeding. That would scare the shit out of me right off the bat.
That's creepy because they're frightening looking. Regular moose are
I've never actually
looking,
seen one. Have you?
They're really, they're giant and like they look primordial.
Right. Well, that's interesting too because there's a great thing a guy describes them as being prehistoric in appearance. Yeah. One guy who cited it, and they are. They look like a throwback to the early age of mammals or something.
Totally.
He said that among them now were 3 big bulls. He almost had the ague when he saw 2 of them were like pygmies compared to the third, the ague. I guess he started shaking. The monarch of the herd, he declared it was a monster. Beside the spectral coloration, there were antlers again, 20 points on one side, 21 on the other. Do you know what that means? The points?
I know what it basically just means gigantic. Antlers with many like sort of, I guess I just think of them as like sort of tree appendages on them.
So I guess the points is some kind of measurement. They're like, I don't know, like 10 feet or something like that. And at least 18 inches wide in the velvet, which I'm not sure what that means. I'm like, do you think the velvet is the area between them? Between the antlers?
I thought the velvet was just like the coating on this shows you, I'm not up on my moose biology, but I thought the velvet was like that fuzzy coating that was on the antler and then they shed that. But
actually you raise an interesting point, which is that a few years ago, a friend of mine got me to take elk velvet, I think it was called. There's like a whole movement there to like ingest elk velvet because it's apparently.
Is this in California?
I was in California. Good
elk
guess.
Velvet.
Listen, it pepped me up. Let me tell you, it pepped me right up. This continues. This giant moose or one of his progeny has been a wonder and a mystery of the Maine woods since the fall of 1901 when Mr. A.M. Cushing, a Boston sportsman, reported sighting him near the Chairback Mountains. That goes on. In the years since, Gilman Brown of West Newbury, Mass. and Granville Gray, a Bangor taxidermist, which is not a phrase I ever thought I'd hear, a Bangor taxidermist, have been among those who have shivered at the apparition in the dusk. They took potshots at the monster, but he would vanish ahead of the bullets. One doubter up in St. John's Lake argued, "It ain't no moose, but it is only an old gray horse that's broke loose from a logging camp and gone wild." That's me. There you go. Thanks. I'm trying. No horse stands 15 feet high, of course, and that's why the, quote, Spectre Moose is still thrashing around in the woods. So that's the original report about the Spectre Moose from the New York Times.
That's fantastic.
But it does, in fact, stretch back a little further, Steve. My research found 1891 is sort of the first sighting of it when the guy described it as being of prehistoric proportions.
Oh.
It continued on, other sightings. 1900, a fella named George Nealand, I love this, was riding. 1900, he was riding his bicycle through the woods, which just makes, the bicycle had to be a fairly new invention, right?
Right. One of those giant wheels, he's up high, right, straight back, I'm
imagining he's on one of those things with the giant front wheel. He's got the little hat on.
With a suit on, yeah.
He's got the suit and shoes on. And he's just biking through the woods? The fuck is he doing, biking through the woods? George Nealand's biking through the woods, and he cites the Spectre Moose. Scared him so much he climbed up a tree. But the same year, guys took shots at it to no avail. 1892, big city, New York City sportsman Howard Van Ness, sounds like a New Yorker. He gets separated from his hunting companions, encounters the beast, said it looks like it weighed a ton. As tall as a camel, he said.
Oh my God.
Which makes me go, as a camel, I would have thought they were kind of the same size. No? Or is a camel, you measure it from the hump to the
I don't think I've seen camels in the zoo, but I don't think I've seen them up close. So I don't know.
Neither have I. But I guess maybe a camel's...
I'm going to accept the authority of our New York witness on this.
Of Howie Van Ness. Absolutely. Shot at it to no avail, but it charged at him at a tremendous speed, at an unnatural speed, and it leapt over him and disappeared into the woods. He said it looked like it weighed a ton, and I found out this fact that, what they estimated as in terms of its horns and its height, it would be 2,500 pounds. The state record, Steve, note this well, 1982, the biggest bull male moose ever captured weighed 1,700 pounds. But according to some of these sightings, it glows faintly. And it can disappear and it can walk through solid objects.
Hound of the Baskervilles vibe to it.
It has a kind of ghostly vibe to it. Here's a good one. This was probably my favorite sighting. After 1917, nothing really happens much. Till the 30s, people start sighting it again quite a bit. I'm going to take you now to the scene of the Molunkus Stream, which I'm not sure what that is. The Molunkus Stream. We got a party of hunters who kill this giant white moose. They kill it.
Oh, really? Oh.
They take it, they slit its throat, and they hang it from a tree, which I'm not a hunting man, but I gather that's to kind of let it
to bleed it out,
I guess, the blood and stuff.
Although that's hard to do with a moose.
Right, big tree. So they hang it from a tree with an eye towards skinning and dressing it the next day. They wake up the next day, the moose is gone.
Oh, really?
That night, a giant white moose wanders into camp. A giant white moose, Steve, with its throat cut.
Oh, walks you can't kill the Spectre Moose. You
Imagine this fucking moose. White moose comes in slathered in blood. Holy fuck. They shoot it. It goes down. They kill it again, seemingly. They go to check it out. It gets up and runs at an unnatural speed.
Oh, my God. That sounds fantastic.
Isn't that fucking great? But just the idea of this white moose all covered in blood and shit, terrifying. But here's what's really weird. Shortly thereafter, Ashland, Maine, Bert Peggins, good old Bert Peggins. I love
Are you making these names up?
No, I'm not making them up, man. This is cold, hard fact, Steve.
Let's hear what Peggins says.
He encounters in the woods a colossal white moose with its throat cut.
Come on.
Shoots at it. No dice. Doesn't go down. He runs into the house. The moose. This is my favorite. The moose then proceeds to pick up the gun with its teeth and fires the gun with its mouth and then splits. What the fuck? I don't know, man. I do not know. Let me see. There's some other. Here's another weird story. Do you mind? Is this all right? I'm just giving you stories.
No, I want to just bracket out Peggins here though, because that strains credulity. Peggins sounds like he's been drinking.
It was my immediate thought was that Peggins had been dipping into the old. Dipping into the old granddad. Yeah, he'd been a little bathtub gin for Bert Peggins there. Something. It's a really strange detail. It's like, what?
Yeah.
This is an even weirder one. Harry Porter, these names. He's on his horse in the woods with his girlfriend. Okay. The horse dies. I don't know why. The horse dies. The moose appears and carries Harry and his girlfriend back to safety in town.
So like he wasn't, in this case, a threat, but a helper of some
He wasn't, well, I don't know if he was ever malevolent. It's just that,
you're right.
People were shooting at him and stuff like that.
Shooting and cutting his throat.
People were fucking shooting him and cutting his throat. I mean, it's like, he's going to piss him off.
He's just trying to get along. What the
Exactly.
hell?
But I'm wondering here, is it like, does the moose pick them up with his teeth and like carry them out? Or does he like kneel down and they climb on his back?
He kneels down, nudges his head underneath them, and then in a regal motion lifts them and
Beautiful. Beautiful. It's like a fairy tale. It was super interesting to me. I discovered that as recently as 2013, 2020. Oh, no, wait a minute. Actually, before that, the most recent sighting of it, Franklin, Maine, 2002. It is definitely ominous in this case. The owner of, I don't know if it's the only restaurant in town or a restaurant in town, spots the Spectre Moose. And days later, the restaurant burns down. And so it's seen as an ominous thing to maybe see the Spectre Moose.
Bad juju, basically. Like you don't want to,
So one of the things what was interesting to me about this that made me start thinking about, because one thing that was emphasized throughout this thing was that it's not an albino moose.
Okay, that was going to be my first question, because it sounds like, because there are these albino deer, moose, other animals. Yeah.
Correct. It's not an albino. I think it suffers from something, It has something called leucism, Leucism, I think, which is some sort of condition that makes the hair white, but the eyes are not pink. The eyes are the color that the animal's eyes would be. So like this Spectre Moose has brown eyes. It doesn't have pink eyes. It's got brown eyes, which I thought was interesting.
So you think it, okay, go ahead.
If the Spectre Moose exists, that's what it is. But there are these animals, and this is what I was going to say, 2013, 2020, 2020, a bunch of white moose, which are protected animals in Canada. And these are these non-albino moose were killed by hunters, and they're protected by First Nations people up there.
That makes sense. Yeah. It's part of the religious systems. Yeah.
And so they were killed. But these were these non-albino moose, but they're white moose. But it reminded me of, in my childhood, I had a mother who took us to whatever movie was playing, because she just liked to go to the movies. So we went to all kinds of inappropriate things, but also I saw a lot of really trashy movies. And I can remember going and seeing a fantastic Charles Bronson film with my mother called The White Buffalo, which is...
that sounds familiar.
Oh, boy. It is. I watched it a few years ago.
Does it hold up?
Oh, I mean, define hold up, Steve. I mean, it's like,
Charles Bronson.
It satisfies a certain something, if you watch it again. But it's remarkably, it's pretty low budge and crazy. But it reminded me, right? The white buffalo and white animals are
sacred.
Yes,
oftentimes,
and are seen as sort of portents. The white buffalo, in particular, among different Native American peoples, is seen as this kind of omen of a time needing people to come together, because there's something sort of ominous going on. So people need to get together again, need to sort of gather strength to deal with what's going on. And these moose are held sacred by First Nations people in Canada, but they're not the Spectre Moose. The Spectre Moose is its own thing out there in the world.
What if the Westerners who sort of settled Maine and sort of New England in general, like they don't know these the traditions of the Native Americans,
right?
And maybe they've spotted something that is natural, but they've then layered on all this sort of spooky qualities.
That's interesting. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
When you were a kid growing up, did you hear about that? Because I never heard about the spectral moose.
I feel like I've heard things about freakish moose, like giant moose, and I definitely had heard the thing about white moose sort of being sacred, but I'd not heard about. And what is kind of cool about this story that I do like is it has a weird overlap into the supernatural, which I suppose you could say all these things do in some way. I mean, you tell me whether it's like, in some sense, they're all a little bit supernatural until they're either proven to exist or not, right?
But
true. This has this kind of ghostly quality that he'll come back, you cut his throat, and he fucking comes back. You shoot him and he doesn't, you leave your gun, he's going to fire at you with his mouth. Your horse dies, he's going to pick you up. You're on a bike, he's going to fucking show up.
There's a bad play quality that's happening, I think, at some point. He can shoot with his mouth. But there is a famous Thomas Jefferson described the moose. And a very famous French naturalist named Buffon, Georges Leclerc Buffon, who was like the most famous biologist in France at the time, contemporaneous with Jefferson. Buffon said, "I don't believe you. This fucking thing cannot possibly exist." And he was just describing the regular moose.
In general doesn't exist.
Yeah. So he sent him paintings of it, and Buffon's like, "No way. Come on, that's crazy." And I think he either shot a moose and sent it, or they sent a live moose to try to persuade Buffon in Paris that this was a real animal.
Moose that just, I'm hoping it was just a fucking live moose that just barreled out of a box in Paris.
Just, how you like me now, motherfucker? I'm going to turn you on to a creature here. This is my cryptid. This is the big muddy monster of Murfreesboro, Illinois.
Awesome.
And this creature basically shows up starting in 1973 and is continually seen on and off until 1976, and then has been sort of quiet ever since. But like you, I found some archives, and I actually went to the police department website in Murfreesboro, Illinois, and I have the fucking police report.
Wow.
Wow. And it's pretty funny.
Oh my God.
I'm going to talk you through this. I've got maybe 3 or 4 of these. I'll just summarize and quote where I can. But the first event occurred June 25th, 1973, and the police report says, it's approximately 2,300 hours. The complainant, one Randy Needman, who's 19, I bear that in mind. The complainant came to the police department and reported sighting some type of creature in the wooded area north of the Big Muddy River next to the boat ramp parking area. Officers Nash and Lindsay were dispatched to the area. The complainant was parked on the south side of the parking area next to the woods. Complainant heard a loud screaming sound in the wooded area and observed a large creature approximately 7 feet tall. The creature appeared to have light-colored hair matted with mud. The creature appeared to be walking on 2 legs and was proceeding toward his car. The creature continued the screaming, changing tones and proceeding toward the car. Complainant then left the area and came to the police department. And then it says,
I love that. I love that dry cop talk stuff too.
Awesome.
Complainant left the area.
And of course, when I'm reading this, I'm like, why is our man Randy Needham out there in his car? And then, of course, the very next line is, a Judy Johnson, who was also inside the car, stated that she heard the screaming but was unable to see the creature due to darkness. Complainant and Johnson also stated that no human could be able to scream or make a noise as loud as what they heard. Officers located impressions of the mud approximately 3 to 4 inches deep, approximately 10 to 12 inches long, and approximately 3 inches wide. So they went there and they found tracks of some kind.
Yeah.
And then the very next night, they get a phone call from Mrs. Harry Ray stating that her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend had just seen a large creature in the field behind their residence. Officers Nash and Manwaring were dispatched to the scene.
Nash is back. Nash is on top of it. Nash is our Murfreesboro monster guy.
There's probably 2 cops.
I'll handle this. I'll handle this. Let me go. Let Nash
Officer
go.
Nash.
Yeah.
I swear, this thing would make a great movie. I would love to friggin'. We should try to possibly figure out
should we pitch our Murfreesboro monster picture?
I'm going to picture you as Nash through this whole thing.
I like that part.
Upon arrival, officers were met by Cheryl A. Ray and Randy Creeth, which gave the following account of what occurred. Randy and Cheryl were sitting on the patio talking when they observed something moving around. Yeah, sure they were. So something moving around a patch of small trees in the field behind 37 Westwood Lane. Both Randy and Cheryl watched and observed a large creature walk out of the patch of trees near the edge of the yard and then turn around and walk back into the field. The creature was described as 7 to 8 feet tall, weighing 300 to 350 pounds, pale, dirty white or cream-colored, and standing on 2 feet, and also having a very strong, musky odor to it.
Right. Classic.
Right? That's classic, isn't it?
That's a classic. The smell, right? Of the sort of, that sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then they bring the dog, the hunting dog, and the dog chases it down. They can't find it, but comes across a slime substance on the weeds. This sounds like such a B movie. The slime appeared periodically as the dog tracked the creature.
What?
Nellis put some of the slime between his fingers, rubbed it, and it left a black coloring on his fingers.
You sure did. I bet it did. You think this is the Murfreesboro monster spore? You think this is, it's poop? Is that what's going on? Weird.
I can't venture, here's the thing. I don't go beyond the evidence. I stay with the data.
Oh, okay.
And,
sorry,
here
Steve.
you are speculating about what the slime could be.
Okay. You're right. All right. Sorry. Wow. Dressed down.
Okay.
That's a sci-fi touch. That's a weird
it really is.
That's weird. Okay.
I was along for the ride until the slime appeared, and now
Can I ask one question before we proceeding? Is it hairy or is it like it's hairy? Okay,
it's hairy. One of the descriptions, maybe not the one I've been. There's a lot of data at the police archives. It is hairy, so it looks like a Bigfoot, but it's white, except it's caked with dirt and it's just really muddy.
Interesting.
And then a month later, this one's great. There's a carnival there in Murfreesboro, the Miller Carnival, run by a guy named Miller, and he claims that 4 of his workers saw the creature. The ponies of the carnival were getting riled up. So 4 workers went to see what was going on, and the creature was standing there examining the ponies, just trying to understand what they were.
Oh, my God.
And they freaked out, and it ran off. And then this guy Miller says, well, I didn't want to say anything because that would keep people away from my carnival.
From my sketchy carnival. That's wow. Wait a minute. That's a scene in a movie. And frankly, I want to play Miller. I want to play Miller the Carney. I want to play the fucking Carney who's got, wow. So they saw the thing standing there kind of, wow, gentle giant kind of petting the ponies.
Yeah, not hostile, but just sort of trying to understand the creatures before it, you know.
That's amazing. It's touching.
Giant.
It's a kind of Frankenstein, like the little girl with the, wow, that's just sort of touching. Wow.
Yeah.
I love it.
Right. I mean, and then we jump ahead to 1976. Now here, the muddy monster has become, I believe, a trope, and we need to be suspicious because now people are calling up and saying, I've seen, you know, the big muddy monster. It actually has a name, and I think people are doing drawings and so forth, and it's kind of part of the local lore. But this one was kind of fun because these kids saw it. And I'll read you one description by Ricky Kells, age 10. Ricky,
little Ricky Kells,
little Ricky Kells stated that he, David Taylor, and Russell Ward were playing wiffle ball when he went to look for the foul ball that was hit between two houses. As he was walking down the hill, he observed a large creature, approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, standing next to the woods. Ricky hollered at David and Russell, and they also observed it. We then ran home to tell our parents. Ricky described it as being 7 to 8, large ears this time, gray in color, covered in hair. And then as it ran away, it made a large thumping noise as it walked away. Now, I'm thinking maybe this is hoax, you know.
You think this guy's like Ricky Kells? You think Ricky Kells hoaxed it or somebody's dressing up?
I think Ricky Kells and his 3 compatriots may have like drummed this up based on what they knew about.
By the way, Ricky Kells, if you're listening right now, Ricky,
Ricky, you're probably 60 years old now. This is like, probably, you know, it's time to come clean.
Ricky, if you hear this, Ricky, step forward. Let us know.
Please step forward and let Chinwag get the scoop.
But you're thinking it's a guy in a costume too, maybe?
I think that maybe the first one might have been a guy in a costume, scare your friends, making out in the car. But then it's weird that the other ones, and I'm leaving a few of them out, like there is a kind of rapid, you know, observation of this thing, kind of too fast for it to have been like absorbed by newspaper stories and so forth. Like it just seems sort of, I'm very open to the idea of an undescribed cryptid primate of some kind. So I'm totally open to that. Not that this is it, but let me read to you the last thing I want to share with you. 2 hilarious letters, both short. Okay. One on University of Chicago letterhead. Written by Lee Van Valen, associate professor. He writes to the police chief, Murfreesboro, Dear Mr. Berger, I have recently heard of your creature, which could be of considerable scientific interest. There have been many reports of such animals, but no real specimens have ever been available for scientific study. If the creature is shot, it is important that it not be buried, unless it is a man, of course, discarded or given to sensation seekers. It should be embalmed or otherwise preserved in good condition. It would be preferable for the undertaker to ship it to me or some other reputable scientist, because its study will need laboratory equipment and other materials. But if this cannot be done, I will come myself and arrange matters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he guarantees payment for any such expenses. Signed, yours, Lee Van Valen.
Amazing.
Is that hilarious?
Good old Lee Van Valen. I love that it's like, unless you accidentally shot a person.
Right, then bury it.
Yeah, I don't want anything to do with it if you actually kill somebody. But it's really funny. I wash my hands of it. That's amazing.
But I love the way he's like, I need to write to these bumpkins down south and let them know how to handle this cryptid.
That's really funny.
Okay, this is the last thing I want to share with you, which is, but this is the gold. Look at, our listeners can't see this, but the writing is a child's writing.
Yes, I can see
He writes a letter, and the letter says, Dear Sir, he's written to the police department, so it's in the archive. We read in the Fresno Bee about your monster. So this thing made the rounds to the national newspapers at the time in 73. He says, my mom can catch it. She is good, too. Please let her try. She loves big adventure like this one. Write her. She is my mom, and I know how good she is. Then he says, her name is Georgia Supnett, and then he gives the address, and then he closes with, where there is terror, she loves to solve, and she is good with guns and knives also.
Wow. Oh my God. What's the kid's name? Do we know?
It's not signed. It's like the mom's name and address is there, but the kid doesn't sign it. It's
my God, that's genius.
Isn't that hilarious?
Holy cow.
Probably
She's
like
good
8
with guns
years
and
old or
knives.
something.
Yeah. Good with guns and knives. Wow. That sounds like a good mother. God.
Are you open to the reality of the Big Muddy, or are you going to be skeptic on this one?
I mean, I'm open to the reality. I mean, it's funny. Yeah. I mean, you know me. It's like I can go into like real weird territory where I'm like, it's interdimensional. And I'll buy that almost more than I'll be like, it's a race of monkeys we haven't discovered yet. For some reason, I'll buy the more batshit thing than
the biology version.
Yeah, than the biological explanation. I mean, sure, I'm open to it. It seems to me though, like, I don't know, man. In America, where everybody, there's just really, do you think that there could be some, like, where are they living underground? Where are they living? It's like,
well, this is very close to the Shawnee National Forest, which is a gigantic, many miles forest.
Okay.
And so it's possible that
Yeah.
it could be living in these thickly forested areas. Like in Maine, like there's how many kinds of moose? How many moose did you say live in Maine? Like 30,000 moose?
I think.
That's crazy.
It is. And but then really relative to how much land there is and how thickly forested a lot of it is, it's probably like, yeah, it's not like you see a moose every 2 seconds.
Right.
So it's like, I mean, yeah, I suppose, sure, I'm totally open to it. It's just, I don't know, something about that one. And yet why am I mean, I'm perfectly willing to believe in a fucking lake monster or something because I'm like, well, it's down there. You can't see it. I don't know. Some reason the sort of forest ape thing, I don't know. I'm like, there's only like 6 of them. How many are there? Like, there can't be very many of them.
Right. You'd have to have they'd have to be able to interbreed and reproduce unless they live really long lifespans. So you'd have to have a large population, maybe 30 to 50 of them.
Yeah.
But if 30,000 moose can live in Maine, maybe our friends, the Muddy River.
The Big Muddy. There was an interesting thing. By the way, you reminded me of one thing, though, that was interesting, the color of it being so unusual. And actually, I forgot to add about, I'm going back to the old Moxie, those Spectre Moose, which is one of the explanations of that is that it's infested with winter ticks, which apparently would give it the appearance of like a more pale color. A normal moose can be infested with these kinds of ticks, which might explain why my beard is white as well. I might be infested with winter ticks. I think that's simply all it is. It's not age.
It's not age, no.
It's not because I'm old. It's because I'm infested with winter ticks. I'm going to move a little closer to home for me. This one's very close to my heart, Steve.
Oh, let's hear it.
You may know this. I don't know if our listeners know this, but I'm a native of the Nutmeg State, Steve, which would be Connecticut.
State.
The great state of Connecticut. Connecticut. Yes. The mighty state of Connecticut, Steve. That's where I'm from. I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. And so I thought I'm going to go for the Connecticut cryptid. Which also sounded really interesting because I was like, I thought to myself, I don't remember ever hearing about this.
As a kid, you didn't hear about this?
No, of course, I'm talking about the Connecticut melonheads. Steve, the melonheads.
The melonheads.
The legendary melonheads of Connecticut. Now, they're not seen just in Connecticut, these things. They're also seen in Ohio and Michigan, but basically it really centers around Connecticut, and it really centers around the part of Connecticut I'm from, which is sort of Fairfield County. New Haven County is kind of southwest, south central Connecticut.
I'm not familiar with the melonheads.
Well, I wasn't either, but as will unfold, I discovered that I was more than I thought I was. And what's interesting, what also made me interested in this is that they are humans. They're not humanoid. They're not like the Big Muddy. They're not like shaped like a man. They are human beings.
They're Homo sapiens.
Yeah, which is also, it gets to me, and this is something I'm going to want to talk to you about when I get through this, into territory more of urban legend or something. Okay. You know what I mean? Of kind of, because it really struck me as sounding like the kind of classic urban legends. These are creatures who are small with bulbous heads. These are humans, small with bulbous heads, skinny, long fingers, bulbous eyes, big mouths filled with big, blocky, crooked teeth. Okay. That's your typical melon head. And as I say, they're seen in Michigan where they're called wobble heads. They're not just called melon heads. Yep. And the whole thinking about this is that one of the myth and this is basic to a lot of it, as you'll see, basic to a lot of the stories about them. They started out as children suffering hydrocephalus, which was called water on the brain at one time.
Oh, yes.
It's a buildup of cerebrospinal fluid in sort of the brain cavity, and it gives you an enlarged head, and it puts a lot of pressure on the brain. It's treatable now, but it's that condition. And in the instance of in Michigan, they apparently escaped from an insane asylum, is one of the stories. And of course, in the story that they go into in Michigan, it's an insane asylum that apparently doesn't even exist, or they were released accidentally. Somebody let them out, and they go into the woods.
Classic, great.
And there's a great story about how they escaped from a place called the Felt Mansion in Michigan, which was a kind of rich guy's mansion that turned into a parochial school, and then it became a kind of institution prison. And that apparently they escaped from there after murdering their doctor and allegedly chopping him up and hiding the pieces all over the hospital. Because I guess they were children and they didn't know what else to do, so they chopped him up. And apparently it's still haunted. The hospital, you see this place, you see ghosts, you see a ghostly reenactment of the murder of the doctor happening.
Oh, really?
So again, this one was interesting to me because it gets into territory that's very like spooky, and it's weird because you're like,
it's sort of like mutants, like because they're humans, but they're mutants of some kind.
Well, there's that they're mutants, but they're human, and there's a kind of tragic backstory. In Ohio, for instance, Cleveland suburbs, again, children are being experimented on by a Dr. Crow. That's very specific, the one account I read. Dr. Crow, spelled C-R-O-W, different ways, C-R-O-W-E-K-R-O-H. Dr. Crow has them in an orphanage, and he's experimenting on them.
Oh, he's evil.
This is how, and this is how they end up having conditions like hydrocephalus. And again, like the Michigan story, they escape. They burn the place down. They kill the doctor. They go into the forests. That's sort of the general pattern of the story. But as I say, primarily it's the great state of Connecticut, my home state, seen all over the state, but mostly in this area. And one of the things I loved about this too is that Connecticut is, you know that the concept of a liminal space?
Oh yeah, in between two things?
Yeah, liminal spaces, it's this concept that's become, it's kind of like hotel corridors or airports or a bus station. It's kind of these like in-between states where nobody really lives there, and they're kind of transitional, and they're a little creepy and haunted.
Yeah.
Connecticut's a fucking liminal space in the country. The whole state is this spooky, weird place because it's a weird state. And it's very rural, and it's more so than people realize. And it's a strange place, and it's transitional. Everybody's getting from New York to New England, and you got to pass through Connecticut.
Yeah.
It's not really New England. It's not really New York. What the fuck is it? What the fuck is Connecticut? And
it's a flyover state on the East Coast.
It's not even a flyover. You don't even bother fucking flying over it. You try to drive
through.
You try to drive through it, and the traffic's fucking horrible on I-95. It's a weird place. So that was part of what interested me about it. And also, it felt evocative of this fact that Connecticut is so weird to me in this way. So there's two versions to the Connecticut story. One is, again, there's an asylum built in the 1860s. In 1960, they escape from this place. They escape into the woods. A small group of them, they start breeding, they inbreed, they begin to exhibit these physical anomalies, and they resort to cannibalism because they have so they're cannibals.
It's
so
all
they're living
there.
in the woods and they're cannibals. And there's variations on this, like any kind of fairy tale. They escape from an orphanage, a prison, an institution. Some versions, they escape from a camp, from a day camp. And they're campers who escaped and stuff like that. So there's all these different versions. Second version, Trumbull, Connecticut, which is near there, near New Haven. A Trumbull family accused of witchcraft in the 18th century is banished to the woods. There's enough of them, they start inbreeding, and the same thing happens.
Witches.
And they're like, so they were formerly witches and stuff like that. Well, the classic thing that I also discovered that I loved is a lot of these sightings in Connecticut happen oftentimes sort of in rural roads or sort of outlying roads in a lot of these places. And here's something I didn't realize, and it's probably common all over the country, but that a lot of these kind of spooky drives where people see spooky things, there's a nickname applied to these things, Dracula Drive. I'd never heard of this.
Yeah, I have heard of that. Is that like a generic term for all these kinds of places?
Yeah, and people call it Dracula Drive. So a given street will be called Dracula Drive because spooky shit happens there.
Oh,
I'd never heard this before.
I've heard the phrase before. Now it makes sense. Okay.
I'd never heard it. And in particular, there's a great incident that I read in Trumbull, Connecticut, on a road called Velvet Drive, which is already a fucking weird name as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, let's just go with that.
Yeah. I was like, it's like a fucking mashed up David Lynch movie, Velvet Drive. I was like, that's kind of creepy. But in Trumbull, this was the Dracula Drive of Trumbull. And apparently a group of high school kids is 1983 are in their blue Ford Granada. And they're out in the woods off of Dracula Drive. They're partying. They're out of the car. Somebody jumps in the car, starts the car up, lights turn on. They can see raggedy, strange figures with big heads in the car. And these guys drive at them in the car. They scatter. The car that takes off, the car disappears.
Whoa.
It stole the car. But here's the really great thing is for years later, many years later, the sightings of the Melonheads on Dracula Drive in Trumbull, they're driving around in a blue Ford Granada. they're still in the fucking blue Ford Granada. So, like, for decades afterwards, they're still in the blue Ford Granada.
It's fantastic. They're living in there.
Great advertisement for Ford Granada. What a car. And so it's an interesting thing. It clusters around these sort of mental hospitals, which I remember these places, the Fairfield Hill Mental Hospital.
Yeah,
I remember
a lot of these were
place.
closed.
It was defunct prisons. Supposedly, there was a thing called the Nike missile site in Shelton, Connecticut. I didn't know that there was a missile site in Connecticut, a silo that operated between 1957 and 1961. And then after that, when it was defunct for a while, now it's a park. They think these people were living there. People were citing them living there. And this is an interesting feature of this too. It's post-war, this thing. And it's very kind of Cold War. And your thing about mutants is interesting to me too.
Yeah.
Because it has this sort of
nukes.
Yeah, aura of these people kind of mutated and kind of.
Yeah.
So this was all very interesting to me because it was a trip down memory lane in some ways for me, because I was like, boy, I had no idea. And Connecticut's such a weird place. And then I started reading about some offshoots of the Melonheads. To wit, the frog people of Danbury. It makes me laugh because I know Danbury, and I'm like, the frog people. And this starts in the 1950s. People talking about the frog people of Danbury, who are this family of people who they now speculate had something called Croizon syndrome, which is where the plates of the skull don't fuse together correctly.
Yes.
So you have a kind of enlarged head with bulbous eyes, wide set eyes, and so that's why I guess they say frog people. And the faceless people of Monroe, Connecticut, another thing with people living in a rural area, Monroe, Connecticut, with a caretaker watching over them. They have vestigial eyes, like those blind fish, and no other features on their face. A little mouth.
Holy shit.
And it's this whole kind of creepy. And I started thinking, I remember in Connecticut growing up, these stories of sort of like these enclaves and communities of these people. I can remember hearing stories like this and people escaping from institutions. And suddenly I thought, I never put it together with the Melonheads before, but I suddenly thought, oh my God, this is the same thing. Anyway, I found the whole thing and there's questions I want to ask you about it. To me, like I said, it's like urban legend. Like it's more like those urban legends than it is like Bigfoot or something.
Yeah, it's not a cryptid, it's urban legend. Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, I think, everything you're describing sounds like a fascination that we had at this time with like developmental and genetic anomalies, which if you remember, like there was the phenomenon of thalidomide babies and these things that they're called teratogens. They come from the Greek word teratos, which means monster. And so in biology, if you study certain sort of carcinogenic substances or like influences in the environment that can be bad for the mother while she's, having the baby in utero, it can cause deformations or, atypical bodies. And it seems like there's a fascination with this stuff in the 50s, in the 60s. Yeah.
70s. I thought that was a really interesting aspect of it too. It made sense that it doesn't, except for that one story about the witchcraft, it doesn't go back far. The rest of them,
they're victims in a way, except for that one.
That's the other interesting thing about it, is that they're always, they're these people who've been wronged by society.
Yeah.
It made me think of how we talk about these things move through time and they'll change over time. So you have fairies are aliens. You know what I mean? It's like the sort of archetypes of these things moving through time. Because what this made me think of was going back to, it made me think of something, the Sawney Bean family. Have you ever heard of Sawney Bean?
No.
Sawney Bean is a legendary, I think he's legendary, 15th century Scottish cannibal.
Oh my God.
And he was, and he was a bit of a boogeyman figure, I think, in a way like an urban legend of the time. That he lived with a band of people in these caves in the Highlands, and they would waylay people and they would kill them and eat them.
Oh.
And they were this sort of, and then it made me even think of like going further back to Greek mythology, to Procrustes.
Yes.
Who was this bandit who would
chop people
up and chop them to fit a bed, or stretch or chop them and eat them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I was like,
it's an old monster.
It's this, and what I started thinking was, right, this is interesting because it is this post-war era, people are beginning to suburbanize, you've got this burgeoning middle class, and it begins to seem like it's a story of fear of these kind of disenfranchised people too.
Yes.
It's fear of the people being pushed to the margins too.
Yeah.
It's fear of these sort of like marginalized people with no jobs, with malnourished, with poor education, with all this stuff. It's a really interesting thing.
And then you're fascinated with them, but you're demonizing them too.
Yes.
Like it's a little bit like the kind of the Hicks in Deliverance. Like
it is a little bit like the story in Deliverance. Yeah, and it becomes this kind of clash between these middle class guys who. And it's this idea of like, you don't know what you're fucking with too.
Yeah.
To go back to go back to something that's supposedly primitive and stuff. But really it's this fear of like, of these marginalized other sort of,
that's
of
really
these people, which I thought was really interesting about it. And in fact, I did read an interesting thing, which I don't really buy this. I really don't buy it, but there was apparently some article written about this as an urban legend, treating it as an urban legend. And it was some fairly reputable folklorist, I guess, who was talking about in Appalachia, there is a group of people called the Melungians, I think, Melugons. And it's apparently a somewhat pejorative term that comes out of the French for mélange, meaning a mix. So it's these people of mixed ethnicities and races that are very much sort of isolated. It's an isolated group in Appalachia. And this person was speculating that Melungian somehow led to Melonhead, which I don't buy it. I don't buy it or anything, but I think it's interesting that the person's connecting it to this idea of these kind of
the marginalized
disenfranchised, marginalized people.
Yeah.
And stuff
that's that's a great point. I mean, it's common in what they call Gothic horror to equate anyone that looks different or what you would ordinarily call ugly with something that's morally bad. So like in all Dickens stories or in like any of the Gothic horror, the evildoer is also like the hunchback or,
right.
And of course
something quote unquote wrong
physical,
with them. And it's but it made me think too of your definition of monster that you told me a long time ago, which is, say that again, what your definition of monster is? I
have a different one every few weeks, so maybe I'm like, you can't, I think the monster is someone that you can't negotiate with or reason with.
That's
it technically comes from the Latin word monere, which means to warn. So monsters are warnings, but I think we use them in all these different ways. Sometimes it's a physical monster. Sometimes it's a moral monster. A lot of times it's just the outsider like you're saying, that then gets sort of demonized.
And it's what you fear and can't explain and things like that.
When I was living in Shanghai, this was when my son was 5. So this is like 15 years ago. Now China's very different, but we used to walk through this park every day to get him to school. It was he and I, and every day there was this woman there, and her family would put her there. She was begging, and she had hydrocephaly, and her head was the size of like a beach ball. It was massive. It was huge. And they had built a wooden frame that was on the ground, and it held her head up because it would break her neck. Her head was so big. She was super friendly, but she, the speech wasn't there. And but my son was fascinated. He was like, "Are we going to see the big head lady again today?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then we would give her some money, and it was like he watched me to see if I was afraid of her. And I wasn't afraid of her, and so he wasn't going to be afraid of her. And it's like human beings are always in this like relationship with anything that's different or stands out. But
always,
in China, they could have just put a shunt in her head and solved this problem when she was a baby. But this was at a time she was probably out in the hinterlands in a village, and they they didn't know to do that procedure.
Exactly.
And now we don't see this in the developed world. We don't see this kind of thing, but you do still see it in the developing world.
Fascinating. Well, that was quite something. That was truly a chinwag for me for the ages, Steve.
Yeah, for me too. Like I have a special place in my heart. Given all the crazy topics we cover, I have to say cryptozoology is very near and dear to me. I see now it is.
Oh, it has
very
been for
near
me
and dear
too.
to you.
It absolutely is. It was interesting. No, that was fantastic. That was highly enjoyable. I hope that all of you out there listening in Radio Land enjoyed it too.
Stayed with us.
Yes, stayed with us. And as always, please journey over to various platforms.
Apple Podcasts, and rate us.
And leave reviews, questions.
And
comments.
Check out our animations. They pop up all over on social media by the great Alex Sokol. And they're really fun.
Yep. Well, this was terrific. Wag on, weirdos.
Wag on. Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films. Hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Topp, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.